D.B. Cooper?
I ain't saying nothing.
It's been one hell of a ride.
Cle Elum was definitely one of those early pioneers that helped bring the sport to the place it is today. I mean, he's an incredible guy, and can't wait to hear some more stories from him one of these days.
For whatever reason, Carl started just telling us stories, and because he found out we were skydivers. He'd start off on these stories, and we would think, this guy's making these things up.
When I first met Carl, he was talking about wingsuits. He said he was one of the guys jumping the first wingsuit.
And I got introduced to Cle Elum, Charlie Brown. And if you've met Charlie, you can understand why back in those days we called him Charlie Brown. He was the epitome, the face, brush cut, hair, and a straight shooter.
He'd pull out a newspaper article, he'd pull out some type of documentation, a poster or a canceled airline ticket or something like that.
And I'm thinking, okay, listening politely. And then he pulls out a newspaper cutting talking about him and his barnstorming days. I'm thinking, oh, well, guess that wasn't a story. There's a lot of stories, and they all start with, no shit, there I was. And then next thing you know, he's talking about these guys he knows who overthrow governments. And so, okay. Then out comes another newspaper article, all right? More to this guy than meets the eye.
I asked Roger one day, I said, could he be D.B. Cooper? He was the right age, he had the right background, and Carl's like, no, 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 no. He just kept saying he wasn't. After a while, he said, but I know who is.
Walter, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie, let me turn TV down.
Okay.
Ah, you caught me while I was taking my medicine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, go ahead and take it.
I already took it.
Oh, okay.
How's everything going today?
Something important has come up here.
I first met Walter back in 1957 when we and several other ex-paratroopers started the Michigan parachute team. Both of us were ex-paratroopers, but neither of us got to jump very much in the Army. After serving, I began working part-time fixing airplanes, and Walter opened a barbershop. But it wasn't until Thanksgiving of 2008 that he admitted to me that he was D.B. Cooper. For several years, Walter and I talked frequently about the D.B. Cooper hijacking. In the fall of 2008, he agreed to let me tape our conversations. They are the only tapes that exist where he describes his involvement in the D.B. Cooper case.
But how did you, in other words, I just didn't wake up today and say, well, I think I'll go at the airport and hijack an airplane. You know, there had to be some process that you were thinking about.
Yeah, well, how did I think about hanging my tomato plants upside down, you know?
When he got on a plane in Portland, Oregon last night, he was just another passenger who gave his name as D.A. Cooper. But today, after hijacking a Northwest Airlines jet, ransoming the passengers in Seattle, then making a getaway by parachute somewhere between there and Reno, Nevada, the description on one wire service, master criminal.
As far as D.B. Cooper is concerned, I think the guy made it. When I think about D.B. Cooper, I think he was a badass.
D.B. Cooper, man, I wish I was that guy. He was a cool cat. He had some big balls.
We tend not to talk too much about D.B. Cooper. It's, it's always on the sidelines.
It's just all rumor and speculation in the group that I was with.
D.B. Cooper is well known among the skydiving community in the 70s and 80s at least.
Exited a plane with a lot of money and that he was never found.
Hopefully, D.B. Cooper, my hero, got away with it.
B.B. Cooper, we got guys out here jumping without chutes and everything, so what did he do special?
Michigan Parachute Club was formed in 1957 and eventually grew to 9 members.
It was a well-modified group. They were all different in their own different ways, but Charlie was definitely the stabilizing effect.
Everybody turn around.
Some more of these to sign. You can sign some more of these.
That's right. Oh, all together now. Don't all turn together.
Show them the shirts. Okay. Get everybody in there.
The last time I seen you was when we jumped that H-21.
I remember back in 1971, Carl and I were sitting there watching television and this hijacking came on. And it was really unusual because it was Thanksgiving Day. And I thought, oh my gosh, these poor people. You know, here they're all getting ready to fly to their Thanksgiving dinner and they're sitting on a tarmac in Seattle with a hijacker. It must have been terrifying. But it was really an unusual hijacking. I remember at the time thinking, why would somebody order parachutes? You can't jump out of a big airplane like that.
He let the people go. He also wished them a happy Thanksgiving. He didn't seem like a hijacker that was mad at anybody or anything like that. It was strictly over money. First thing that crossed my mind is who would do that was Walter. And Walter had always talked to us about using a parachute to pull a robbery. It got more interesting when we found out later on that it was him.
It just come to my mind that I did it. I didn't even know if I was going.
But you did have a note. You did have a hijacking note.
I still didn't know if I was going through with it.
Well, I know, but I mean, there was a process.
There wasn't any process. No, I'd have been better prepared if there was a process.
But you had a note. All the note said was, I'm going to hijack an airplane. Even if you said, well, I might back out. But there had to be a point at one, because then you went and you drove your car to Spokane and got a bus ticket. So there had to be some process.
I was still unaware, Charlie. I was just numb in the head. Am I going to do this or aren't I going to do it?
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with two personalities. One that does it and one that don't want to do it.
One that wants to do it and one that thinks that it would be prudent not to do it, probably.
Right, yeah, we put it that way. In other words, one personality is divorced from the other when you get into something like this.
Okay, but one personality, I mean, there are two personalities, but one of them was doing something because one of them got in a car, drove to Spokane, parked the car there. And why Spokane? That seemed like an out of the way, I mean, just...
I wouldn't drive it to Portland.
No, I know.
No, right there. At Spokane right there, you leave it a lot, nobody pays no attention. There's no connection.
This is how Walter grew up. On the streets of Detroit, he had a little sister. Times were really hard for him. His dad had been electrocuted.
And their mother was very, very young. I think she was maybe 16 when she had Walt. And so when her husband, who was going to school to be a doctor, passed away, she worked. And she also was young and maybe not the most responsible parent and would leave them alone for days on end. And I remember they talked about how in the refrigerator there would be a tomato or two and some salt.
He would try to steal food off of food carts, vendors had and so forth. He eventually ended up in reform school at 10 years old. Walt and Willard met in juvenile detention when they were just kids. They were best friends forever.
My dad was Willard Stahl, and he was Walt's best friend. Him and my dad were thick as bees, man.
And Walt would always tell the story of how they met, that Walt did, he put some egg in a telephone return, and when people got their dimes back, they would get grossed out by the raw egg. So they would leave, and then he would go grab their dimes and take it. But he got caught once, and he went to juvie. And while he was in juvie, Willard said to him, "Hey, what's your name?" And he didn't want to tell him. And Willard's like, "Oh, you're a tough guy." He goes, "Well, what's going to happen to you tomorrow?" He goes, "I don't know." He goes, "That's what I thought. You haven't been here before, so let me tell you what's going to happen." He said, "The judge is going to call you in, tell him you're really sorry, call him sir." He gave my uncle some tips of how to talk to the judge and get off easy.
You know, some of the stories I heard about Dan and Walt, I guess when they were kids, my grandparents had rented a house in Detroit, and while they were at work, Walt got a hold of a buffalo gun and went in my grandparents' house and shot it into the wall. When it went through the wall, it went right into the bathroom and shot the toilet. That's why they were the devils.
Once you got on the airplane, once you actually walked on up there and they shut the door, you were pretty much committed then. I mean, you could have backed out. You could have just said, well, screw it, I'll rent a car at the airport at Seattle or some darn thing. You know, basically, when you went up and got on that airplane, you were 99.9% committed then.
Yes.
Dad was always, he was tough on his kids. You know, we were all good. Then after a while, we started hearing the stories about him and Walt. I think, well, God, how come we got to be good when you guys weren't?
When you were on the bus going from Spokane to Portland, where did you keep the dynamite thing?
You know, between my feet and ankles.
Oh, okay, you kept it on the floor.
Yeah.
Did anybody sit next to you?
Yeah, right there, but they got off in a little bit, you know. It was a baby, a woman with a baby. Baby cried all the time.
Did the woman say anything at all other than hello?
Yeah, right there. I held her baby bottle right there when she was burping the baby.
What were you thinking on the way there? I mean, was it...
I was thinking this is pretty stupid.
But you still kept going.
Yeah.
I think my uncle really wanted to have a father, and he really felt like he missed something. And I don't think he ever really had that connection with someone that he thought was a father figure. He was very close to his mom, and even though she wasn't, even by her own admission, a good mother when they were young, she did love her kids, and you know, I think he had a good relationship with her when she was older, but he never really had that relationship with a man that I think he wanted. And maybe that's one reason he kept his friends so close.
Some of the deepest relationships I have are the guys I've met wingsuiting and jumping out of airplanes.
All the people we've met in this sport become family.
We jump out together, we share these most incredible moments together.
This is my life. This is all I know.
We share a very unique bond of letting go of an airplane and loving every minute of it.
Camaraderie, I mean, that's like the only team that I've been on.
It's just a really cool group of people, and they're my family.
I wouldn't say that we're adrenaline junkies, but it is part of the sport.
And all I've done since 1982 is live at drop zone.
Back in the 50s, you know, those early skydivers were really revolutionary. I mean, the stuff they were doing, jumping these round parachutes and landing like a ton of bricks.
It's humbling to talk to you, the people that came before me, that, you know, there were a different set of rules, and they were the ones that, you know, even from the first baton pass that was done both in the world and in the US, it's just amazing everything that's been accomplished that we've done. And as we keep passing, you know, that metaphorical baton to new heights, to new adventures. And it's it's just a pleasure to call you a friend and other jumpers that you learn about that. So
I really am taken back by it. I really am.
Well, give me one of these, partner.
Thank you very much.
We used to put on parachute shows up in Saginaw, Michigan, and we were drawing large crowds.
And they ran an article on some real crazy people who were jumping out of airplanes. Somebody had always wanted to try. There was a phone number there that contacted a guy named Walt Reca, the barber up in Royal Oak, Michigan. And he said, next weekend, why don't you just come up and say hi? Walt was living above the barber shop. I walked up the stairs, there was one light bulb in the hallway. And it amazed me because I went up there and I thought I could see something hanging from the light bulb, and sure enough, it was an extension cord that went over the door jamb into, I knew immediately which apartment was Walt's. Went in, the room was almost as dark as the hallway, but they were sitting around spit-shining airborne jump shoes, boots, type of deal. And that's how it started.
So then when you, the bus took you downtown, I suppose, or something, and did you walk to that hotel, or how'd you end up in that hotel you were at?
Cab.
Oh, okay, so you took a cab from the Greyhound station, we'll say.
I don't know the name of the hotel, but when I used to work out of Portland, you know, would go in there to work when there was no work around anywhere else.
Yeah.
Right there. We always stayed at that motel because they had a bar in the basement right there, and they had girls dressed up real nice, you know, shorts and nylons and all that in the bar. It was like a businessman's bar. It wasn't like I just picked a motel out of my head. I knew where I was going.
Although at the time, jumping out of airplanes was fairly new, and people thought we were crazy to begin with, so they'd just come out to see the sudden stop rather than the opening shoot. Did some really crazy things, throwing dummies out, keep the crowd on their toes. The first jumps we were making were with surplus parachutes that came from the Air Force. It took me a while to get my arms around Walter, but he always had that little edge that you were looking around the corner at, trying to figure out what was going on next.
After the Michigan parachute team quit jumping, everyone went their separate ways.
Can you think of any more reason why you're telling this now?
Probably because we got into it gradually. It wasn't like, hey, Walt, what about this? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, this has been going on for a couple of years now.
A couple of years.
I never told nobody. Right, you're the only one. I mean, I don't feel that I'm exposed talking to you. And that's because I trust you, you know.
Walter married Joni, my wife's best friend.
Joni said to me, guess what? Walt proposed to me. And I said, well, you want my real opinion? I wouldn't do it. She says, why? I said, the guy has got a terrible drinking problem. And she says, my boyfriend belongs to a skydiving club. There's a lot of really nice looking single guys. You might meet one or two. Walt said to me, oh, you got to meet Charlie Brown. He's going to be jumping out of an airplane. He came down, and he kept coming down, and he wasn't pulling his ripcord. So everybody ran off the tarmac, and we thought, well, this guy's done. His parachute mushroomed, and then his feet hit the ground. And when he walked up, I said, you know, you're really a jerk. You know, that was my first encounter with him.
Walter kind of drifted off into the hinterland at that time. I lost track of him for a while, and I didn't realize till later how deep Walt was into the Cloak and Dagger.
This is the time where you said that you were making some money selling guns. You can't make a whole lot of money selling guns.
The kind that was selling me good. Those fellows didn't guns. That was the British submachine gun during World War II.
Walter and Joni had a lot of hard times. He was a barber, and he just didn't make a lot of money.
There was a beauty shop next door. Some lady had parked her car in Walt's driveway, and he was getting ready to go to work. And he was blocked in. He goes into the beauty shop and he tells the lady, can you please move your car? She says, I'll move it when I get done. Well, he went back to his house, got his machine gun out, went out there and shot her car all to pieces. His barber business came to a screeching halt when he gave a guy a haircut. You know, he said it was a good haircut. He said the guy jumped up, started raising the devil, and started yelling at him, and Walter turned around and beat him up.
After his barber business closed, Walter had to find a new job. Walter went down to the Teamsters and said, you've got to give me a job. He started his career driving a cookie truck. Soon he got off the cookie truck and he got into the enforcement part of the Teamsters, but that didn't stop him from getting into trouble.
And this is when his friend told him, hey, I've always wanted to rob a Bob's Big Boy. Will you go with me and drive the car? I'll go in. So they went and parked in front of the Big Boy. His friend chickened out. And so he got irritated and said, I'll go do it. So he went inside the Big Boy and, you know, with an empty Tommy gun, according to him. And then in his mind, he left $100 bills on all the tables of the people who stayed and ate and watched this like it was a movie. And walked out, and it just so happened that 2 police officers were coming to have dinner and heard on the radio that a man matching my uncle's description, was robbing the big boy. So even though he tried to get rid of the gun and the money behind the bushes, they still caught him. And after that was when he jumped bail and took off.
Walter worked for the Teamsters, but he lost his position after the big boy robbery.
After the big boy, he went out west. He used to get in trouble, then he used to run to another state.
Walter decided to meet up with his drinking buddy Don Brennan, who lived out west.
What happened there is I got out on bond waiting for a trial. So I just took off right there to California for Don Brennan's place.
Jail was the only thing that really scared Walter. He wasn't afraid of guns or anything else, but he did not want to go to jail.
He was interesting in a way that he was quiet. As I learned later in life, those are the people that you learn to watch out the most for. And Walter was that type of guy. He'd be nice as pie one day and clean shop the next day.
You know, Walt was always like a sneaky person.
He was the kind of guy that you'd really like to be sitting around talking with. When he wasn't robbing and sticking up somewhere and lighting somebody's house on fire, he was a decent guy. Not only did Walter jump bail, but he told his wife he was going out for a loaf of bread. He didn't return to Joni for at least 15 years.
And Joni didn't know where he was. And for many years, she didn't even know if he was alive.
And so that's when this whole odyssey started, where you ended up in Wenatchee. He sent you the money, and you went up to Billingham, was it?
Yeah. Carol and I started living together about November of '65.
Walter met a tall brunette, and she had a kid, and so he marries her. And he gets her knocked up.
Pregnant.
And screwed. Anyway, not, regular time, they have a baby. She was the type of person that nothing was ever good enough. They didn't have a good enough place. And
He was determined at that point not to be poor. And so when I asked him why he did it, he said, better off dead than poor. And I think the point where he was in his life was he was so tired of being poor and of seeing his children being poor and his wife nagging about, we got to pay rent, we got to buy food, I have no clothes, how are we going to live, I want a house. That I think for him, he just didn't care if he lived or died. And so when you look at something like the D.B. Cooper jump, it almost takes somebody who didn't care if they lived or died.
Here's what the planning was right there. I loved them two kids, the babies.
Yeah.
Right there. I didn't have much money. Right there. They were ready to start school. There was no future. The only workaround was at Grand Coulee Dam, and that's why I got that place in Heartline. So prior to that, I was thinking if I fell off the iron and got killed, at least workman compensation would give them enough money right there so they could buy a home. And that's what was going through my mind at the time.
You were kind of like, in a way then, you were kind of down and out.
Yeah.
But I mean, usually you don't act like you're down and out. Even when you didn't have any money when I knew you, you were never bummed out, shall we say.
Yeah, but I didn't have the responsibility that I had then. And plus, at this time right there, I jumped probation also. So I was still wanted. In other words, at the time, I thought I had no future.
Don't need no preacher man to tell me right from wrong. Don't need no real estate to prove where I belong. Don't need no passenger to tell me where to go. Don't need no travel guy to go and steal the show. Just me in the open road, got it going on.
Walter, who was used to big city life, found himself living in a rundown house in Heartline, Washington.
I had to drive 20 miles to get a loaf of bread in Heartline. It's 20 miles one way and 20 miles back.
Yeah.
Right there. I mean, I wouldn't drive 20 miles for a 25-cent newspaper.
Heartline is a small town near Grand Coulee Dam where Walter worked.
The early days of Heartline, it was quite a bustling little community, but with the Depression, the population started going down.
My lights tell me where I'm going to. The dust tells me where I've been. The motel is my living room. The bar is my bed, you know.
From the time that I can remember, we had a population of about 200. Everyone thought the town would die, but the town was about as dead as it could be. It has stayed just like you see it now. We've never gotten what I call overly rich, but we've been able to keep improving and having a good life, so what more can you ask for?
Just me and the other road, got it going on. Ooh, yeah. Just me and the other road, got it going on.
You remember anything as you were driving along?
I kept on thinking right there, this is a f***ing stupid idea, and I don't have to go through with this.
You know, one thing I find really curious, you know, Walt was an experienced skydiver. You know, you guys did it all the time, summer and winter. I never understood why he wore a suit and a tie and a raincoat. Why he didn't, if he knew he was going to make this jump.
Because that's how people traveled in those days. He traveled, he wanted to look like a businessman. Walter built a realistic looking bomb using 6 road flares, a battery, and wires.
How did you hook up the wires to the flares?
Yeah, you could see wires, and I had tape around them right there, and I had the wire bent in as if it was going to a fuse. And the things on the bottom right there, where you're sticking around like a nail,
yeah,
I had them cut off.
When you rode on the bus from Spokane to Portland, you wouldn't have been wearing your insulated underwear then, would you?
Yeah.
Even on the bus?
Yeah.
So you didn't need to have any other kind of a bag or suitcase or anything?
No. I got the underwear still, the bottom piece. It wouldn't fit anymore.
When you got there, do you remember anything you did while you were there? You probably had a couple of drinks.
Yeah, I had a couple of drinks right there. Then I figured I better get right there because I don't want a hangover. I want a clear head. Didn't have that much, and I still didn't know if I was going through with it.
What was your last day like before you went out to Portland Airport? Did you sleep that night, or were you restless and tossing in bed?
I had a hard time going to sleep, but I went to sleep. Yeah, because I said, you know, I don't have to do this. I mean, there was 2 people in my head, you know. The left shoulder would be the devil, the right shoulder would be the angel. You know, the devil made me do it.
So you took the shuttle to the airport. Had you checked on the airlines that you were going to get prior to arrival, or playing it by ear?
Playing it by ear, that's all. Yeah, there was no plan, no nothing. I mean, really nothing. You read about it in the paper, you know, this was clever and that was good. There wasn't a thing clever about the whole deal.
At the airport, did you see anybody there that was unusual?
No, I was hunched in the corner. I would be the only person who would be unusual out of that whole bunch. And I always thought people were staring at me.
Around noon, Walter arrives at the airport, buys a $20 ticket one way to Seattle. He signed in as Dan Cooper, a name the media changed to D.B. Cooper.
Did you know what kind of airplane you were getting on?
No. There was no planning to anything. You know?
Well, how did you know that there was a door and a tail that went down then? Because that was only on one airplane.
Everything's real vague.
It was sheer luck that because of Thanksgiving traffic, nobody was sitting in his row.
You had that seat all to yourself. There were only 35 people on the airplane.
Walter boarded the plane at 1:45.
What if they would have assigned you a seat and there would have been a guy sitting right next to you? What would you have done?
I never thought that far ahead.
Just getting the empty row of seats was just the luck of the draw.
Yeah.
At 2:05, the airplane took off as scheduled. He was sitting in the back row and the flight attendants were sitting right behind him. He had a typed note in his pocket, but he decided to write a new note to simplify instructions. The handwritten note said, "Miss, I have a bomb. Sit next to me."
You took off out of Portland and you ordered a drink, or you lit a cigarette.
I always liked cigarettes.
How many packs of cigarettes did you have?
Oh, I must have had less than a carton. I'd say maybe 8 packs.
Now, where would you have put them?
In my pockets.
Now, where did you carry your note?
Inside pocket of the suit.
At 5 minutes into the flight, Walter handed his note to flight attendant Flo Schaffner. Thinking the note was personal, she put it in her pocket.
What was the note about?
I can't remember right there. This is a hijack and I've got explosives.
After reading the note, Schaffner does come and sit beside Walter, and he shows her the bomb.
When you gave that note to the stewardess, was that the hardest thing that you had done so far? Because that starts the whole thing.
That committed me.
You know, you were always saying, well, I could back out. By the time that you did that, backing out was getting a little bit late right then.
Walter instructs Schaffner to tell the pilot that the plane has been hijacked.
So you did hand her the note, and since she kind of put it in her pocket, like she said, I can't believe you're actually hijacking this airplane.
And I says, I can't believe it either, but I'm serious.
Walter demands $200,000 in used $20 bills. He also demands 4 parachutes, 2 main backpacks, and 2 reserves. He wants everything brought aboard the plane when it lands at Seattle.
Anything on how you told them to get the parachutes and the money in $20 bills and whatnot?
Used $20 bills.
Oh, you wanted all used ones?
Yeah, I didn't get all used ones, but I got a lot of them were used.
How did you order the parachutes? Did you say I want 4 parachutes, or did you order 2 reserves and 2 backpacks?
2 reserves and 2 backpacks.
Had you already told them by this time that you got to go to Mexico?
I don't remember. It come up somewhere in the conversation.
While the airplane circles, Walter's demands are met and the airplane lands in Seattle.
So you ride the airplane on up to Seattle, and you can see the weather outside, and you can see it's pretty bad.
You can anticipate that it's pretty bad, but when you're numb in the head from fear, you don't seem to notice the weather, the clouds,
When you got to SeaTac, did you tell them to circle until they got the stuff ready?
Yeah.
You were drinking drinks. You weren't drinking beer, I know that, but you were drinking.
Yeah, I was drinking liquor.
So that had to kind of putting you back on your heels a little bit, because you're not a liquor drinker.
It didn't settle me down any, though, Charlie. I was so scared it was false security. It was like a baby takes a security blanket right there. That was my security blanket, but it didn't do any good. I didn't feel very secure.
Did the stewardesses ever look scared to you?
No, they were well composed. I think it surprised them as much as it did me.
After the plane lands, it is parked on a remote taxiway where it is refueled and awaits the money and the parachutes.
When that airplane landed in Seattle, it had already been hijacked. You never talked personally, you said, to the cockpit crew.
No, I talked to the stewardess, and the stewardess relayed the message to the cockpit.
And they were always verbal.
Nothing was written.
Do you remember, once the plane landed, were they just free to open the door?
They were looking at me and asking me.
You mean the stewardesses were?
Yeah. What to do? I didn't know what to do. I said, do what you normally do when you got all these people here,
So, you were holding these people for ransom, though, until you got the money.
Yeah.
So the door must have stayed shut.
Yeah, nobody jumped off right away.
So how long do you think it was before the airplane took off?
I have no idea right there. If it was 5 minutes or 7 hours or 3 weeks right there, it wasn't in me to be thinking at this time. I had to freeze emotional thoughts. What was going through my mind all this time right there is smoking cigarettes, scribbling on a napkin, and if I get killed, am I going to go to hell?
Do you ever remember taking your sunglasses off in the airplane?
I remember, but I probably did to wipe my eyes. I always do that. And also, I didn't want too many lights on in the plane. Didn't want no snipers coming in,
Once time passed, let's say a couple of hours, how did you actually get the money?
They brought it to the front right there, and then I got it. It was brought back to me.
Okay, and who brought it back to you?
One of the ladies, the stewardess.
Now, at some point, you start examining the parachutes or the money or something. Did you even open the bag and look in to see if there was money in it?
Yeah.
It's getting to where it's time to go, and you tell the stewardesses that you tell them what?
Tell them we're going to Reno. And what altitude to fly?
Well, but I mean, the people got off.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving.
Right. Did you make kind of an issue out of that?
No, I was asked, can they get off?
And you said yes.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
And you give them instructions for how high and other things, right?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
I asked, how slow can you fly this? What stall speed? You don't want to go above that.
When you hijacked the airplane and they were flying from Seattle, Tacoma, now you're going to jump. You ordered them to have the gear down.
Right there, well, the wheels don't slow the aircraft down right there. And the flaps right there is when we're jumping. Right there, you know, you give it flaps right there, cut power. There's drag right there, so I'm not going to be hit.
Well, you ordered them to fly at only 200 mile an hour.
Yeah.
Why did you pick the back door, by the way?
Because they had a side door there that says red letters on it right there, open here, and I said I was going to open that right there, and she mentioned that there's that tail door there, so I said, well, that's good.
So, at first, you were thinking about going out the side door.
Yeah.
And the stewardess actually talked you into going out the tail.
She didn't talk to me, she just mentioned it.
Just mentioned it to you.
Yeah, I don't have to up the inside the airplane, you know, because at this time she didn't know what altitude I was going to be going out at.
Why did you open the one parachute in the airplane?
See that it wasn't tied off.
Was that a reserve or a main?
It was a main.
So now you're down to the one main.
Mm-hmm.
Did you wear a reserve when you did this?
No.
But the reserve that was the dummy chute was kicked out of the airplane.
Yeah.
Okay, so you tossed that out way before you jumped?
Yeah.
The parachute that you opened in the airplane, you did cut shroud lines off it, you know. What did you do with the shroud lines?
Had the money on to me.
Okay, so that's what you tied the money on to you with?
Yeah. Took my belt from around my waist, tied it around my raincoat, put the money in there, right there, button it all the way up to my neck.
And then put the parachute on?
Yeah.
But you'd already opened the other chute, too. You didn't even examine that chute at all, or even hardly look at it.
No. I tossed it out, that's all. You know, just get rid of everything that I could.
Nobody from the cockpit had ever come out of the cockpit, other than the stewardesses going in and out. You never seen any of the pilots or co-pilots or anything like that.
I'm quite sure they were peeking out, you know.
That had to be terrifying when you're lowering those stairs. They had to be grunting and groaning because they're not made to go down in flight. And the wind and all that shit like nothing that you have ever heard.
Yeah, well, right there, when we go into Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde wasn't as scared, was he?
What's your first thing that you do that you can remember doing?
Put a rubber band around my glasses to hold them on my head.
Where did you get the rubber band from?
In my pocket. So I'd have goggles going out.
By the way, did they stay on?
No.
When you figured this thing at all, I know you've told me a bunch of times there wasn't any planning. Did you time it so it would be a night jump so that nobody on the ground would be able to see a jump?
No.
In other words, that was just luck of the draw as well.
Yeah, just whenever it happened. First of all, right there, in my sane moments, I believed it would never happen. So, when it happened, it surprised me as much as it did everybody else.
So he just went out, cleaned and jerked, and the chute opened, and when the chute opened, he said, "I made it." Those were the words he used, "I made it," which I thought to myself when he told me that wow, Walt, you still had a long way to go.
Yeah, you know when you peel a beet, how red it looks?
Yeah.
That's the way my face looked when I looked in the mirror. After it all happened right there with that rain hitting me in the face.
Could you see when you were going to hit the tree? I mean, were you really moving over the ground?
I couldn't notice that much.
Did you see the tree before you hit it?
No, I hit the tree first.
Now you're plowing down through this tree, limbs breaking and all that crap.
The only dead tree in the forest that I happened to get to it.
You've landed now, and you know your leg's in bad shape. Twisted ankle or something.
Yes, broke.
Could you tell it was broke?
Yeah, it hurt.
So then you buried your chute.
No, I just gathered it all up right there. They put it like in the back pat and left it there with the broken trees. Threw a few branches on top of it.
When you're walking out, does the money still like around your chest in your raincoat on?
No, I had to clean myself off, took the raincoat off, put the money in the raincoat. Had like a bundle.
Was it hilly where you hit or just kind of flat?
Flat.
So when you walked out, it wasn't really too bad of walking.
No, not bad at all right there.
And you could see the cars though before you landed on the ground, right?
Yeah.
It's a wonder you knew which way you were going though.
I didn't. Right there, I seen cars, it was in the distance.
So how did you know which way to even walk in the first place?
Right there, towards the direction right there where I assumed the cars were going, was like a little knoll, It was a slope of the ground. I just got up there, about no higher than a little tree stump,
Yeah.
And then I could see in the distance right there traffic.
If you'd have jumped 2 minutes before you did, you'd have been right in the middle of a huge forest.
It would have been in something.
Yeah. Was your leg throbbing?
Oh, everything, yeah. I mean, my legs, my head, my hands are shaking, my sore leg right there, I could feel it swelling up.
Did you have to take your shoe off, or would it still fit?
No, I'd never take my shoe off, because then you couldn't get it back on. Then you draw a lot of attention, walking around barefooted in November.
Yeah. So you walk out, and you get to the road.
There's a neon light there, the restaurant.
Okay.
It's dark, but you can tell it's not a town or anything.
Yeah.
It was just a restaurant there.
Yeah.
Maybe a quarter of a mile away.
You're walking along to the restaurant, and you get there, and do you remember anything, or you just find a door and go in?
Yeah, I find a door and I go in. I ordered a cup of coffee, my hand shaking real bad right there. It spilled. I got some change from the waitress right there, and I asked her where the telephone was, and I called up Don. And I said, I done it. He said, you done what?
Yeah.
I had discussed it with her before.
You had to get directions to tell Don where to come and pick you up.
I give it to the guy with the dump truck, the telephone. He gave him the directions.
Oh, he gave you the directions?
He gave it to Don. That's how come I remember him good too, with his guitar, cowboy hat, western gear right there.
How come he was by the telephone?
I called him over.
Oh, just to tell him where you were, to just say to come and get me, yeah.
Because I don't know where I was. He knew where we were.
Oh, yeah. So you sat there and drank coffee for 2.5 hours?
Yeah, right about that. It could have been 2.5 hours right there. Could have been an hour, See, I was just staring and numb. You know what I mean? Staring at they got a menu overhead. Like hot dogs, hamburgers, or whatever it is. And I was like mesmerized by just staring at that sign.
The night of the hijacking, Don Brennan picked up Walter at the Tenaway Junction Cafe and took him home to Heartline. Once he was home, Walter took his clothing off, took them to an abandoned house and hid them in the basement. The following Monday, Walter returned to his job on the Grand Coulee Dam where a doctor set his broken leg. It was vitally important for Walter to go back to work following the hijacking. The reason being, he did not want anybody to know that he would have anything to do with that hijacking. He left work on schedule and he returned to work on schedule, and that was important.
1971, when they were building the third powerhouse, many of the local people went to work and found jobs at the dam. And along with it, people came in, and they lived in both Elmira, Heartline, and Cooley City, and they rented homes that were available.
I'm waiting on a payday, stretching every way I can. No rest for the wicked and a hard-working Georgia man.
Dams are no good to work on. They're terrible places to work. Water up to your ankle all the time, to curing the concrete. There's carpenters 12 inches on center. You know, and you're trying to drag a lead right there to do some welding across all that. As soon as work broke anywhere else right there, I quit the dam.
Towing the line, bringing home the bacon, putting in my time.
These are the underwear bottoms that D.B. Cooper wore the night that he hijacked the airplane and jumped out. This note is one of hundreds, maybe thousands, I don't know. It's from Walter, D.B. Cooper, to me, Charlie. I don't know what it is in my life, but all kinds of dishonest operations come my way while I'm just sitting home with one foot in the grave. This is the Tenaway Junction Cafe near Cle Elum, Washington. These are full of files on different things, birth certificates of the D.B. Cooper's family as kids.
This investigation's been going on for 20 years. And sometimes it gets really frustrating. Starting in 1998, the Michigan parachute team for about 10 years got together for a reunion at the place they called the Billabong. When Carl started going to the reunions up north, the guys would be up there and they'd tell all these terrific stories, and Carl every year when the reunion came around would send a newsletter. And one of the guys said, you know, Charlie's a really good storyteller. You know, we ought to have him write these stories down. We're gonna all die and they'll be lost. And that kind of began the whole thing. Carl started talking to Walt. One night we were sitting there watching TV and the D.B. Cooper story came on again. And I said, you know what? That guy says the same things that Walt said. Like, I said, remember when he robbed Big Boy? He always called me young lady. And I said, that's exactly what he said to that flight attendant. And Carl said, you know, it does sound like Walt, you know, it could be. I said, you know what you ought to do? I said, you know, he kept writing these chapters about all of Walt's escapades. And I said, write one chapter where you say Walt's D.B. Cooper and see what he says. Make the whole plan out and type it up. And then the next conversation he had with Walt, Walt didn't mention it. And he said, well, hey, Walt, what did you think of that last chapter I sent you? Walt says, you give me way too much credit for making a plan. He said there was no plan. And Carl's eyes got really big and he said, holy cow. And after he hung up, he says, you're not gonna believe what Walt just said. And I said, what? He said, he pretty well admitted to me he's D.B. Cooper. And that's how the whole process began. He just ask a little question here and a little question there, and pretty soon Walt just started opening up.
Let's go back to where you very first thought of this thing. Was it because if you hijacked an airplane, you could get more money than out of a bank?
I seen some kind of a TV thing where they were robbing something on television. I don't know what it was. And they got the money, then they wanted a bus, and then they wanted a plane. Well, I thought I could eliminate all that by just getting the plane.
So, see, Walt, there was a thought process here.
You're trying to analyze something that wasn't there.
Well, there is something there. I mean, it isn't a baboon doing this. You were doing it.
The individual that did it, you know, that's another personality that had an IQ of -15.
Well, you can't say that because it worked.
Met Walter back in '04 when my dad invited me up to their cabin get-together with a bunch of friends. My involvement with Walter was just hanging on out. He made a really good Swedish meatball. He would cook for everybody. Any of the conversations we ever had were stuff about their old days and when they were jumping out in drop zones, and it seemed like a reoccurring theme. Later on, my dad had mentioned to me that Walt was involved in the DB Cooper hijacking, and certainly from what I had known about his jumping experience, it was plausible. The only real time I ever really got Walter to say anything to me about this, and mind you, he would never start in the beginning of any story and say, "Hi, I'm DB Cooper, I jumped out of an airplane." If I started in the middle of the story and said, "So when you jumped out of the airplane, what did you see?" Then he would start talking about things. But if you ever brought up a DB Cooper or anything like that, he just wouldn't talk about it. He'd clam right up.
When I first heard about he could be DB Cooper, bells started going off. I said, well, Walt did some real stupid stuff. I wonder if he could have done that. He could have. He was always trying to be conniving. He's always one step ahead of the law. But he could have, because he was gone for quite a few years.
So for many years, my uncle, I would ask him or indicate about the DB Cooper case, and he would say, he would just be elusive. He wouldn't say it was him, but he wouldn't say it wasn't him. But I knew at that point, and he gave me some papers that he said were his confession, and I read it, and it talked about the DB Cooper incident. So as I read it, I started asking questions. So I asked things like, how long did it take you to plan something like this? He said, well, I always say, and he had said this in stories previously, but never do anything that you can't write on the back of a napkin and figure out in an hour. And he said it didn't take long to plan it out, and he had thought about it a couple times, but really he was drunk in a bar and wrote it on the back of a napkin, like probably half the other crazy things he did.
I knew I was going to have some on tape to ever prove anything that I was hearing. So I went and bought a cheap little tape recorder at Radio Shack or somewhere, and I got the stuff to hook it up to a telephone and so on. And so the first time I did it, I told him, I said, Walter, I went and bought a tape recorder, and you've got to give me permission. It'll be more like an interview. I'll be asking you some questions. And he simply said, okay. Nobody could make him talk, and he was really good at keeping his mouth shut. I always started out talking about the team, and I tried to get him in a good mood because he had a hell of a sense of humor. If I asked him a question and he'd come back and give me an answer, he would talk. If I asked him a question, if it was the day he wasn't going to talk to me, he would just be silent. This went on for years. This didn't go on for weeks. This went on for years. I'm going to say from 1998 until late 2013. I miss Walter more than I missed any of my other friends. Not that I wasn't good friends with them, but just that we had so many long conversations and I found out so much. He called me on 24th 24th of November 2008. He always denied being D.B. Cooper, but that night there he said, "I am D.B. Cooper." And of all the things that we ever did, and the drinking beer and the fights and all that crap, we never lied to each other. Of course, his whole life he was living a lie, in a way. There's a lot of people that, you know, went to an early death on account of stuff he did.
Did the thing go about as you pictured it when you first thought of this? In other words, did you have any image of how this was supposed to
come out the way I pictured it?
Yeah.
Of course not.
How did you picture it?
I didn't know, Walter. I had no concept of how it was going to come out. You know, I just don't know how I pictured it, but no, anything that happened to me and that happened to the plane and the FBI and everything was just, it was as new to me as it was to them.
Walter kept telling me angrily one time, he said, "Why do you keep saying Portland?" He said, "I never was anywhere near close to Portland." And I says, "Well, nowhere near close to Portland, how far really?" And he said, "I don't know." He said, "But I know one thing, I wasn't anywhere near close to Portland," which he wasn't. But he didn't know right where he was. He knew how he got home, so that really helped me out. And I had the highway, I had Blewett Pass, I had Kashmir and Highway 2, and so I knew if I knew how he got home, I knew approximately where he started from, but not exactly.
My interest was to try to narrow down where he might have jumped at and look on Google Earth. From his description to me, he jumped out, and when he got lower to the ground, he could see car headlights. He could see two bridges and cars crossing those bridges. He landed. He said he wadded up his parachute. I was Airborne Army, and I know exactly what you're trained to do exactly is to wad up that parachute. That's what they teach you, it's reaction. He headed toward the main road that he saw when he was jumping, and then went to a small little kind of a truck stop rest area.
I somewhere got the numbers of some cafes out in that area of where he went home from, and the first one I hit. There was a girl named Jerry that was a waitress in there. I told her what I was looking for. I said, "What I'm looking for," and this place might not even exist today, but I said, "Years ago, in your area, not too far from you, probably within 15 miles of where you're at, there was a cafe. It was open until midnight. It also had gas pumps, and it did not serve beer." And she thought a minute, and she says, "That was the Teanaway Junction Cafe." And she says, "You're right, it's not there anymore. It burned down about 10 or 11 years ago. And there's a fire hall there now."
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know, I'd never really been there yet. So, but there would be a day when I would go out there and check this story out and found everything just as she said that it was. And that was very helpful because now I knew the route that he took to get home. I had a road map and I looked at all the little towns anywhere near that Highway 97. And then I called him up one day and I started going over them, and I'd, go this one and that one and Ronald and blah and blah and Cle Elum. Well, he didn't know the word Cle Elum. I said, Teanaway. He said, "That's it." I placed a compass that Loretta uses for her artwork on SeaTac, and I went to that place where they said that Cooper landed, and I swung an arc, and it went right over Cle Elum. The timeline is that he left the Seattle airport at 7:38. He got to the cafe at 8:35, made the phone call at 8:42, and the whole time to do the Cooper hijacking from Seattle to the time that he got to the Teanaway Junction Cafe was less than an hour.
I'm familiar with the D.B. Cooper case, having flown the 727, and I'm very familiar with flying in the Pacific Northwest. If I were to fly from Seattle to Reno in an unpressurized airplane with the flaps and the gear extended, I would only go east. Flying east, you can clear the Cascades in about 15 minutes. And then you can proceed south without any terrain issues. And that is my problem with the route that is stated in the D.B. Cooper case.
My name is Ron Taylor, and I started as an air traffic controller at Miami Center in October of 1970. The air traffic control system in 1970 was basically just broadband ASR radar. There was no automation to speak of in the system until around 1975, so it was very antiquated compared to what we have today. The way they worked back in the old days is most aircraft would go Victor Airways or Jet Airways, and they would fly from a VOR to another VOR. An airway is like a roadway. It's in the air. It's connected by points or VORs, okay? And those points interconnect, and the pilot tunes in and goes to those points with checkpoints, and the controller monitors that to ensure the aircraft is still on the road. I would think that the TPX-42 would probably have a range of maybe 50 or 60 miles, depending, okay, on what's in its way. And mountains would be a problem for a radar. Radar tracks line of sight, so if there's a mountain in the way, then it would not pass through, so you would not be able to pick up the target. The loss of an image would be very common, so it's very possible they could lose a track or target.
So I know there may be a discrepancy between which route the aircraft took. It's hard for me to understand why they would take the route that they said they took.
The FBI, like all law enforcement agencies, relies a great deal on source information. So the FBI had to rely on Northwest Airlines for flight path information. And the FBI's information is only as good as what Northwest Airlines provided them.
Back in the day in Seattle, I would think it would make more common sense to go away to avoid mountainous terrain, okay? Not to fly into a terrainy area, because could have a problem with that, okay? And if the Cooper flight had to be at 10K, 10,000 feet, why would you want to put yourself at risk unless you're in VFR conditions where you can see everything, and undoubtedly this weather conditions was prevailing, then why would you take a chance? Because the controller's not going to see it, but he knows also there's obstacles in the way, and this pilot's going to have to climb and descend to avoid or go around or deviate from his course. But again, you don't do that unless you have visual. The pilot can see VFR out the window. I mean, I wouldn't do it. I mean, that's kind of like a no-brainer. But if they did it, you know, somebody had good luck.
I could make a very strong case for the FBI not releasing the exact flight path of that plane for fear that public would be contaminating any scenes that might be along that trail or destroying evidence.
The government will lie, okay? The government's not going to tell you everything. In the case of the D.B. Cooper, if the government put out that this guy flew this route and all the money has been dumped and everything else, and if they told everybody, the gold rush would be on, everybody would be looking for the packages. It'd be like Area 51. They're not going to tell you what they're doing, but there are things going on. And when things or incidents happen, they're not going to tell the public straight up front, everything. In some cases they shouldn't, but in a lot of cases they should.
After all, there was $200,000 taken in this hijacking, which was a lot of money in those days. It's in cash, and the public knows that. And they'd be drawn to any likely crime scenes to look for that evidence.
That night I jumped in Saginaw. That was my third jump that night, and I went over to, the anemometer that Sadie had in his hangar over there where the wind was blowing? Yeah. And it was blowing 45 miles an hour and gusting. So the wind never bothered me, you know, what the outside wind's going to be, you know, because I made that one and survived it. Yeah, of course you broke a leg, too. Yeah, a couple of them. Yeah.
For those of you unfamiliar with parachutes, there is a difference between the old style round parachute, which is the kind that was used by D.B. Cooper, and the new flat ram air chutes of today. This is the ripcord that we've all heard about, that when you jump out, pull your ripcord. It opens the case, allows this to come out. This is a pilot chute, and this drags out the round canopy. It's important to note On the D.B. Cooper hijacking, he did not have a reserve that he could snap on his chute, so he jumped with only the main chute and no reserve.
Okay, you ordered 4 parachutes, and there was 2 main chute, 2 backpacks, and 2 reserves.
Yep.
But you did not wear a reserve.
No.
Okay.
I was too bulky with the things in my raincoat. The reason I found out that one chute was a sawdust chute,
Yeah.
because all reserve chutes right there have a rigger seal on it. That didn't have a rigger seal. So that's one of them training reserve chutes. No lead seal.
But that's the only chute that you found that was out of the ordinary. All the rest of them looked okay.
Yeah.
The back door of a 727 can be opened by any 10-year-old who can read. It's just a lever. It has a placard there. It tells you clearly how to open it. You know, they talk about the back door in a 727 being some sort of great mystery, when in fact in the 70s, that's how they got on and off the airplane. So if anybody had ever ridden on a Boeing 727, they walked up that back door. At the time, they had no safety mechanism on that door to keep it from opening in flight. And the safety mechanism that they put on there is called a Cooper vane. I used to fly 727s. It's kooky. The notion that it's some sort of great thing for somebody to jump out of a jet airplane is just crazy. I did it, and 10,000 people a year do it or more. I never understood why that was a big deal. If you're in Army and you're an airborne, you jump out of a jet airplane every single day. What he did wasn't anything extraordinary. He just jumped out of a jet airplane, and it happens every single day. Every day.
You did see the composite picture that was drawn of Cooper.
Yeah, I was real skinny then.
But that picture didn't look anything like you. It looked like Kevin Costner. That's who the picture looks like. It didn't look like you at all.
How can you get a good drawing of somebody right there in a dark light?
All I had was what the girl described.
Yeah.
Her description of you wasn't that good. I mean, when you looked at it, that's the one thing that Loretta said. She said, well, they couldn't be that far off on the drawing. And I said, they're always off. I said, don't you see these drawings and then they catch the guy and the person doesn't look anything like it? You know.
Yeah. That's on television. You see that all the time.
Eyewitness description is the worst kind.
Just recently, I was watching a detective story, and he said eyewitnesses' accounts are the most unreliable.
Absolutely, and they are.
It didn't appear to be a very good composite drawing, but I think it looked like Walter as much as composite drawings look like who they're supposed to look like. In other words, you've seen them, I've seen them, we all see composites on the TV that they draw for some guy they're looking for. He said, if this is the guy they're looking for, no wonder they never found me.
If you look at the picture that they originally came out with D.B. Cooper, the sketch, that's Walt. Well, then it changed afterwards when they wanted to take suspicion away from him. If you follow Walt's story, that the CIA recruited him. Well, of course they wanted to take suspicion away, so they changed the drawing. Slightly every time a little, but then it didn't look like the first drawing, and the first drawing's Walt.
Eyewitness composite sketches are difficult to evaluate. If we had a case, for example, where the suspect was seen by a couple of eyewitnesses, we send an artist out and get a composite sketch done of the suspect. There's a decision to make as a lead investigator on that. Do you release that to the public? Because you may be sending out something that doesn't resemble the suspect at all, and you end up with a bunch of leads that you have to investigate with limited resources, and you may be doing yourself more harm than good. So you've always got a decision to make whether or not to bring in a composite sketch and release it to the public, because they are invariably inaccurate or misleading. For instance, there were composite sketches of the Unabomber case. If you compare the Unabomber they later arrested, there's no way you would make a match. Since the 70s, I know that there have been many, many court cases thrown out on the basis of eyewitness identifications that were later proven to be wrong.
Years later, 40-some years later, Walter describes this thing to me. He described a guy about as tall as he is, younger though, and he called him Kid. At that time, Cowboy was about 10 years younger than Walter was. And Walter said he had on cowboy clothes. He had a guitar case, so I figured he's playing in a hillbilly band, you know, and driving a dump truck. And I figured, well, the dump truck is his day work, you know, and they had a lot of logging going on there, mining and stuff like that. So I figured, well, it's, you know, he's a dump truck driver by day and he plays country music at night. So that's how he described Cowboy. Years later, I traveled to the small town where Walter had landed and started asking around. I met a guy named Wayne Willett who ran the Shell station in the middle of town. And I said, okay, I'm looking for a guy that drives a dump truck by day and he plays music by night. Wayne Willett said he'd check around. And I give him my name and address and phone number and that, and returned to Florida. A week later, Wayne Willett called me. He said, I've got your guy. Don arrived about 11:15 that night. Before Don could come into the cafe, Walter jumped into the car to avoid anybody seeing its license plate. Walter said, let's go. Before they'd driven a mile, Walter says, I did it. Don said, did what? And he said, the thing I told you about in the tavern when I planned it. Don said, I was drunk. I don't remember what you said. Walter tells him about hijacking the airplane and jumping out. Then he reaches into the money bag, gets Don some money, sticks it in his pocket, and said, don't ever tell anybody about this ever again. After he told Don Brennan what he did, Don said, you know, the penitentiaries are full of guys like you and me. A lot of these other people have been working on these D.B. Cooper theories and stuff. The one thing they didn't have, of course, was Walter. And, you know, he had certain information, and that information led me to where I am. I had to find out exactly where he landed. He kept saying, I don't know where I landed. He was talking about he didn't know where he landed, like in that field. You know, he wasn't talking about he didn't know where he landed approximately, because he did. He knew by the way that he told me that he went home. And so I said, well, you were on Highway 97. We know that now. We just had to back him up to where he landed.
Scott Brennan called me yesterday. He called me about what's supposed to be shot.
You never did ask him where you were, did you?
We don't even talk about that.
I know.
Because if I did right there, he'd never call me.
Really? You're kidding me. He's that paranoid?
Yeah.
God, he ought to know better, because you're not going to do anything he won't even talk to you about that. I've never heard of anybody being so scared of anything in all my life. I've often thought about calling him, but you told me, you said, well, you can call him, but don't mention that or he'll hang up on you, you know. I just figured, what's the point?
Yeah, don't scare me, old man.
On the drive home, Walter's foot was throbbing, but he knew if he took his shoe off, he'd never get it back on. They took Highway 97 to Kashmir, took a right turn, which goes right by Heartline. Once home, Walter went to bed, but he said he couldn't sleep. He got up several times to look under the bed where he'd put the money in an Air Force B-4 bag. In the morning, he walked down the road to an abandoned home which had an unlocked storm door. That's where he hid the clothing from the hijacking. After hiding his clothes, Walter convinced a friend to drive him to Spokane to pick up his car.
I couldn't believe I did it right there. I pulled out the money and looked at it, and I still couldn't believe I did it. I had to pull it out again.
In order to avoid detection, Walter knew he had to arrive at the Cooley Dam for work that Monday morning. His supervisor saw him go up the iron, and he called him back down, and he told him he wanted him to go to the infirmary. to get his leg checked. At the infirmary, the doctor checked his leg and he told Walter that this was an old break. And Walter said, no, he says, I heard it this morning. And they argued about that back and forth a little bit, whether it was an old break. And finally the doctor said, well, I'm going to set your leg for you, but I do think it's an old break. That was a perfect solution for Walter because he knew he couldn't go to a hospital and get his leg set. That would have drawn suspicion.
How long did you sleep with the money under the bed?
About 2 weeks right there till I was able to get up right there and walk around and go, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Till I decided right there I better go to Vancouver. I didn't cross the border at Blaine. There's another place east of Blaine where you cross the border where there's no custom agents. You just go across the border, and that's at Sumac.
Once Walter crosses the border, he puts the money in a safety deposit box of the Sumas branch of the Royal Bank of Canada.
In the 70s, the customs procedures were nothing in those days compared to our procedures now. There were no electronic searching machines. It was simply a verbal exchange between you and the customs officer. The identification requirements weren't there in the 70s. You could even move from one country to another without even going through customs, for example, in remote areas. It's simply much different in the 70s than it is now.
Banking in the early 70s, when I started, was totally different than it is today. There was no computers. Everything was debit and credit tickets. If we looked at people's accounts, it was on microfiche. Probably is possible that someone could come to a credit union or a bank or an S&L and actually open a safety deposit box with little or no ID.
Walter didn't deposit all of the money in the safety deposit box. He kept some out. He bought some furniture with some of the money. He put a deposit on a house and he gambled some. He knew he was going to have to continue work. He used the money as a cushion, but there were jobs at times that come along that now he didn't have to take, which up till now he's already had to take a job no matter how lousy it was, He said the money had him freaked out, to use the hippie word. He couldn't leave it alone. He was scared when he moved it, and he was scared when he left it there. He bought normal things with it. He spent the money. Yeah, he gambled with it one time, at least one time in Idaho, when he was going to a job or something.
Where were you when you played poker with some of the money? I thought you said in Idaho.
Yeah, Wallace, Idaho.
How come you still had money then?
I didn't put everything in the bank right there. Wallace, Idaho, right there. All the bars had 3 or 4 poker tables all the time in the back in Idaho.
And that was about 6 months or so, did you say, after?
Yeah, right about there. After this happened, then I bought a home in Spokane, 1207 Cleveland Street.
Okay. And put a down payment on it from the Cooper money.
Yeah.
In 1972, Walter and his, quote, wife, they answered an ad I had in the newspaper on a home that I had for rent. And when they arrived, I was very impressed with Walter when I met him. It was very congenial, very kind. We sat there at the table and we talked for a minute or two. We began to talk about negotiating a lease on the property. And Walter said he would like to have a 2-year lease. And then we had more conversation about, yes, they would like to have, and I said, yes, I would agree to the lease. And so I took down what information that they gave me, names, addresses, their dates of birth, and driver's license numbers, and went back to my home and instead of filling out a lease agreement, I decided these people are really the people who should actually own this house. And so I actually filled out an earnest money agreement for them to purchase the property. That's $675 in cash. I don't want a money order from Hong Kong, and I don't want a credit card. I want to know that I've got my money. That's what I want. And so that's how that transaction would have also been done. If I recall correctly, they had a U-Haul truck that they had come with, And I recall an automobile that they had, which was also a nice automobile for me because I like old cars, classic cars, correctable cars. And they had an AMX, and it was copper tone in color, and it was beautiful. And I think she drove the car and he drove the truck. He had the type of personality where you could trust him.
The FBI said the money couldn't be spent because they'd sent a list of serial numbers to the banks.
In the 1970s, sending a list of serial numbers randomly to the banks probably got no impact from the banks. The banks aren't regulated by the FBI. The banks are either regulated by the FDIC or a state charter, a federal charter, asking employees to go through their teller drawer and try to find these serial numbers. And even if they did find them, what does it prove? Where did that money come from? If the government compiling the money had written down or photographed all the serial numbers, I don't know what they would have done with them at that point. Banks aren't checking any serial numbers, or, I mean, it's just not common practice. How do they mandate that you would even do it? You tell them, you know, we don't have the manpower to do this stuff. To my knowledge, there's no tracking of serial numbers, there's no tracking of the date on the bill.
When D.B. Cooper made the jump, when he went out the back door, he didn't die, he didn't get killed. He broke a leg. The good thing about it was Walter was given a couple of months for the leg to heal. And in the meantime, he went to work at a small building that they were building in Spokane. A few days after I returned from Cle Elum, I got a phone call from a guy that identified himself as Jeff Wasatich. He said that it was him that was there that night, and yes, he drove a dump truck for a logging company, and he played music that night at Grange Hall. So that is how I met Cowboy.
My name is Jeff Wasatich. I stopped at the Shell station here in Cle Elum, which I used to work at, when I was in high school, and the owner's son told me that there was a guy looking for me. And I says, a jealous husband? What is he? I have no idea. He says, no, he said, this guy's from Florida. I says, I don't know anybody from Florida. I said, what's the deal? What does he want? He says, well, this guy's name's Carl. He left me a card. He said to give it to you. I said, what's he want to talk to me for? I said, I don't know anybody down there. He says, well, he said, he stopped in here and asked me if I knew anybody that drove a dump truck, wore a cowboy hat, and played country music. He says, you're the only one around here that did that. I told him, well, I'll give you the information. He wants you to call him. I said, okay. I said, I'll call the guy. I said, I got nothing to lose. So I called him up, and we got to talking, and he says, do you remember such a thing, that night, blah, 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 blah. And he says, you remember anything about that? And I says, holy cow. I said, that's over 40 years ago. I says, let me think a minute here. So I paused for a minute. I says, yeah. I says, I remember something, just before Thanksgiving. I said, about 40 years ago, somewhere in there. I'd seen this gentleman walking. It was dark, raining, snowing, blowing. It was cold. The old Tanaway Junction Cafe used to set right about in this area, which had burnt down, and they built a fire station after that. Anyway, I parked the truck out here. I came in, I was sitting down drinking a cup of coffee, and this man walks in with a black suit, white shirt, black penny loafers, his raincoat rolled up under his arm. He looked like a drowned rat. His hands were beet red. He was shaking. I told him, I says, I'm sorry I didn't pick you up, but I said, I can't have hitchhikers, with a dump truck. He says, that's okay, kid. He says, no problem. So we ordered a cup of coffee, and we talked a little bit, and he says, if I dial a phone number, he says, can you give this friend of mine directions how to come over here to pick me up? I said, sure. I says, no problem. So he went into the back room there where the telephone was, an old dial crank on a wall phone. He dialed a number and he says, they got this guy over here that lives here. He's going to give you directions how to get over here to pick me up. So the guy on the phone says, where are you located? I says, well, I'm at the Teanaway Junction. He says, where's that? I said, it's over by Cle Elum. I says, which way are you coming from? As you going to come over Snoqualmie Pass, you coming up over Stevens and Blewett? How are you going to get here? He says, well, I'm going to come up over Blewett. So I gave the man directions how to get here, and I handed the phone back to this guy in the suit, and I went and sat down on the counter and drank my coffee, you know. And then I had to go out to the Grange Hall, which is about another 4 miles out of town, to play music for a Grange function. I told the guy, I says, you going to be okay? I says, I'm not sure what time they close. He says, oh, my buddy will be here pretty soon. He says, no problem. He says, thanks for giving him directions how to get here. He says, I'll go ahead and buy your coffee. I says, what a guy. Thank you. I shook hands with the man, got in my truck and left. I spent 6 years in law enforcement, and one of the things they teach you is you look, you observe, you know, you learn to observe people, what they're wearing, what they look like. You know, how tall are they? What color hair do they have? Do they have any hair? You know, I mean, it's just different things, you know, that you learn to, just gets in your mind and you just keep it there.
A big question that people will have, are Walter, Cowboy, and myself telling the truth?
Unlike the FBI, I, as a cold case investigator, now have in front of me much of the information that the FBI had, plus I now have a possible suspect. So now I look at all the information that's available to me, pages and pages of transcripts between Carl Lauren and Walter Reca, wherein Walter states he is D.B. Cooper. I've also got Walter's last will and testament, corroborated by witnesses that in fact was Walter's last will and testament. And we've also got other witnesses who tend to corroborate Walter's account of what happened. So now my task is to look at all these statements, determine whether or not I see truthfulness or deception, and render an opinion. In Walter's case, because I needed to rely on transcripts of the audio tapes that Carl or Charlie Brown made of his discussions with Walter, I didn't have the capability of looking at a videotape, which is very advantageous because you can see many different things in a videotape. You can see eye movements, breathing perhaps, the blinking of the eye, any nuances in how he forms his words, that sort of thing. So those variables weren't available to me. So I needed to rely strictly on the audio tape and the transcripts. And the audio for Walter shows he is consistent throughout all the tapes over many different sessions with Carl. So I feel comfortable in saying that there's no question in my mind that Walter believes he is D.B. Cooper. With Carl, I was able to interview him in person, which gives me a lot of advantages. I can get a fix on his communication patterns, both in an informal setting and in a formal setting. There's no question Carl believes Walter is D.B. Cooper.
I haven't followed it at all. Right there, once it was over, it was out of my mind totally. I mean, totally out of my mind. There's one thing that I'm quite sure of right there, that the government itself that investigated this put a lot of disinformation into that.
Well, I think they did too. They say none of the money was ever spent and you were dead.
Yeah.
All of the investigation on the D.B. Cooper hijacking concentrates on the 6 hours in the airplane. D.B. Cooper, the story that I know, goes on for years and years and is more interesting than the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Or at least it's just as interesting. I suppose that depends on your perspective.
What did you think all through life, how did you feel? I don't even know how to ask this really, because this is such a unique thing. How do you feel knowing that you were D.B. Cooper and nobody's ever caught you or even got close?
Never give it a second thought.
You never give it a second thought.
No, right there, it was done and it was done, you know, and right there, and
was there a time in life where you nearly forgot that you were D.B. Cooper?
Yeah, almost right afterwards. I started putting the money in the bank. I had that all figured out. I had family, you know, take care of, and overseas jobs come up right there.
But you didn't think it was then that big a deal. It was no more than robbing a bank like you'd done in the past or something.
No, it wasn't. It was no deal, really. It was done, you know.
Yeah.
It was done, and I lived through it.
He's got cards he ain't showing. He can never let you in. If you think he'll ever love you, you better think again. There are places he's going, and you never really know how the riches he's offering you, are they real or just more fools gold? You find yourself falling in love, you know your heart will break. You can't help but giving him love, all he can do is take. There are places he's going, and you'll never really know are the riches he's offering you, are they real or just more fool's gold? He's got cards he ain't showing, he can never let you in. If you think he'll ever love you, you better think again. There are places he's going, and you never really know how the riches he's offering you, are they real or just more fools gold?